AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
Gary.
John, how are you?
I'm doing well. You too?
Absolutely.
Good.
I think, though, at the top of the show, this is the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and I think that we have the freedom to be able to say all kinds of stuff on the show.
Whatever we want.
It's those people that made that happen for us.
No doubt about it. Right. Yeah. No, a historical time for sure.
Absolutely.
What an event. But let's talk automotive.
Let's go right to it.
Right. In fact, we got to tell the audience, we got Dave Andrea here from Plante Moran. Every year they do a supplier survey. And boy, we're going to dig into the results of that. And we've got Ken Zino with us too, longtime automotive journalist and PR executive. And so, yeah, you probably have the first question, Mr. Vasilash.
All right, Gary.
All right. So Dave, explain to the audience what the OEM supplier relation index is all about. You guys have been doing this for a long time. It's been validated for years and years and years. Give us a snapshot.
The snapshot is it's been going on for 24 years. It actually was started by Dr. John Hankey, an Oakland University professor in marketing, to be able to judge quantitatively the relationship between the vehicle manufacturers and the suppliers, because it is a messy relationship. So how can you quantify it, make it standard to judge it year by year so you can see what the track record is? And you can also look across the vehicle manufacturers to see how well they stack up. And so it's about a 100-question survey, 6 open-ended questions. And I'm always surprised that the suppliers do take all of the time that they do to go through that.
They take it seriously.
They take it very seriously because it's anonymous, it's confidential, and this gives them a way to give their honest feedback to the vehicle manufacturers. And just a quick story. Last year, we were up against the Friday deadline, and I got a call from one of the top 10 suppliers who said, "Dave, can you keep the survey open through the weekend?" So what do you mean? He said, "Well, we haven't got our guys together and we haven't filled it out. So can you just keep it open through this weekend?" In fact, of all of the suppliers who I would have thought had leverage and the confidence to tell the OEM directly what they felt, it would have been this supplier. But they used our survey as a conduit.
So you're saying that this supplier, you would have thought, would have been able to talk to their counterparts at the OEM and say, you know what, this relationship is not as good as it should be, or this relationship is the nicest thing I've ever experienced?
Well, when you think about leverage, right, this is one of the top 10 in the world. So by dollar amount, they have leverage. And certainly by technology and innovation, they have that as well.
But they felt comfortable going through your survey, not going through executives at the car company or purchasing execs, especially at the car company.
Exactly, John.
Right.
Well, David, perhaps, but perhaps I might add that I once worked for a senior Ford purchasing executive who, in support of your story, was described by a major supplier as the Izod alligator. All teeth, no ears.
That's classic. Can I use that?
Yes, you can.
All right.
So, I mean, give us a sense, okay, so we talk about suppliers and OEMs, okay? Describe what the importance of suppliers are to car companies.
Well, at the dollar amount level, there's 70 to 80% of the dollar amount of a vehicle. So when you look at the transaction price and take out dealer profits and take out the manufacturer profits and look at the cost of goods sold, that's outside purchases. That's the supply base.
So for the audience, let me just say, what you're really saying is the car companies only make 20% of the car. They buy 80% from suppliers.
When you think about what they have vertically integrated, the vehicle manufacturers, the engines, the stamping, assembly value, that's their core.
Right.
And of course, the design of the vehicle and
Right,
so,
but because other people are going to be screaming at us. Wait a minute, Tesla's not that way. Tesla's far more vertically integrated. BYD is far more vertically integrated. What we're talking about are the legacy automakers in North America buy 20 to 30%, or only make 20 to 30%. They buy the rest from suppliers.
Correct.
And they rely on suppliers for most of the innovation that goes into cars.
Yeah. So when you're there, Gary. So when you're thinking about from the dollar amount side. When you think about it from the innovation side, all of the software and the other sensors and all those types of things, that knowledge is resident with the supply base. And so that's why the relationship is so important. And just a couple of examples here. We've done studies for other vehicle manufacturers outside of the public survey. And they're doing it because they aren't in the top realm. They aren't going to have the volume to get the supplier's attention. So they want the relationship part of it to get the supplier's attention so that they work with the other vehicle manufacturers.
Dave, here's the thing about your survey. For 24 years now, Toyota and Honda have always been at the top. Always. They go up and down a little bit every year. Your latest survey shows them actually improving. Lately, General Motors has been getting better, but it trails them. Nissan's been all over the map. It's below GM. And then Ford and Stellantis. I mean, suppliers don't like Ford or Stellantis. They don't like the way that they're being treated. Why is that? And why, after so many years, are automakers not looking at it and say, hey, we got to get our relationship better?
Yeah. On the top end, on Toyota and Honda, I think it's because they're primarily engineering-driven companies. And so, and then as well, and I do believe it with Toyota, is about human relationships in terms of taking care of people, because they know when the problems come up, they know they're going to pick up the phone, it's going to get answered, and the suppliers are going to have their A team out resolving the problem. And so I think it is definitely a cultural piece with them, but starting with engineering and also manufacturing kind of being at the core of what they do and how they go about their job. With Stellantis and Ford at the bottom, and as you look at the historic chart, they've been up in the top four, so, and then dropped down, and then now are at the bottom. I want to say that's a piece of the relationship in the organization, in the purchasing organization. And specifically with Stellantis, if you go back to Chrysler days, and with Dan Knott, I mean, that Dan was an engineer, right? Very, very well respected, came over as the head of purchasing. And the suppliers would, go to hell and back, right? For him. They loved him. And the products were good. The pricing was good. The delivery was good. So you could do that from that standpoint. But you see that it's not integrated into the way they do business because it's one individual. And unfortunately for Dan, passing away way too early.
He died of cancer, at a young age. Terrible.
Then it drops off. The other piece of it is if you think about the regime changes at the top of those companies too, you really have to be aligned top to bottom to make any of these relationships work. And that's where it comes down to. With GM, I'll say with GM, what's been impressive to me with them is they've gone through 3 vice presidents in 5 years, right? Steve Kiefer, then Kiefer went to international, and then Shil Paneman came in right behind him, and then he got a promotion out of there, and Jeff Morrison is now the head. And they have continued to increase. So that shows me that at least with GM, it's getting more institutionalized.
So I think that we need to give the audience a sense of what we're talking about
Okay,
here in
yeah.
terms of the difference between these companies. And so this is on a scale of 400, which basically is unobtainable, I think. Do you agree? Anybody would get to
Well,
400?
okay. On one side, in terms of just even survey methodology, when you get a survey, right? And these are on a 1 to 5 scale. Very, very rarely will you circle the 5, right? You put the 4 down. So yeah, Gary.
Okay, so Toyota, this is this year's, okay, that just came out a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
Okay, Toyota's at 368, Honda 344, GM 299, Nissan 255, Ford 197, Stellantis 152. Okay, it's not even half of what.
A yawning gap, you
Yeah,
might
I mean,
describe it.
So I mean,
yeah,
there's always
yeah.
occurred to me. And then and as John said, I mean, if you look at this over the years, I think Honda beat Toyota once in 24 years. But those two have just been bumping along at the top.
Yep.
And so you have a 10-year performance index, Ford down 70 points, Stellantis down 93 points.
Yeah. Well,
how do
and
they build cars?
Well, you see the big stair steps too, right? With Stellantis going back 2 years when they put out their new terms and conditions.
They had a
Right.
riot on their hands.
Yeah. And
I mean, suppliers went ape, and they ended up firing their top 2 purchasing execs, right, in North America and internationally.
And pulling back their terms and conditions to their old terms. And so if you think about all of the expense of putting out new terms and then going through the corporate debates and the expense of pulling them back, that's never, I don't believe, has ever happened in the industry that way. And because those terms impacted all of the suppliers across the board, there was that revolt, right? And now, and when they changed leadership, both in Paris and in Auburn Hills, the survey reflected that.
In a better way.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it jumped up. Yeah, correct. It reflected those changes and they bounced back up. Marlo Vitis.
Okay,
yeah,
but
but go
that's
ahead.
from
Gary.
128 to a whopping 152. I mean, when you talk about jumping up again.
Well, it's off of the bottom, Gary. I'll give you that. It's off of the bottom. But the thing is now, even year-to-year improvements are going to be so difficult because you have to win back the trust. And getting back to Toyota and Honda being on the top, the mindset of that purchasing organization has to change completely. And that's so very hard. Yeah.
Hi, Ken Zino again. Let me just point out that in my experience, I was on an earnings call after the disruption from Shanghai and the COVID thing. And so I'm on the Toyota earnings call. And the head of Toyota says, yes, this is a real problem. Our customers are waiting too long for our cars, and we have to do something to help our suppliers. I go to the Ford earnings call, and the head of Ford says, yeah, it's a disruption, but the good news is we got to raise prices on the Mustang. Period.
Mm-hmm.
There it is.
Yeah. And the difficulty in all this is, so thinking about, we have to help the suppliers. That can be a cost in the near term that gets accounted for, right? So that's why there's a lot of resistance to that. What we can't account for is the better launch 6 months from now, or the better technology a year from now that helping the suppliers today resulted from. And that's where it has to come from, the top leadership on down, and then have engineering and manufacturing support purchasing as well.
So Dave, when you,
in
you
there.
you come out with this report, do the car companies say, hey, come on in, we want to go through the numbers with you, we want to get a better understanding of it? Do you talk with them?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So before the press release comes out, we go and sit down with each of them individually to give them their results. And of course, they're always egging me, trying to find out what the other OEMs do. It is a competitive industry, without a doubt, that way. And then the press release comes out, and then we go through with each of them and give them their report and sit down. I'll tell you, from top to bottom is a pretty good gauge of engagement, of who's
that was-
asking me questions.
That was going to be my question. I mean, the company's at the bottom of the list. They've been at the bottom of the list for years now. Do they not care that much? Do they ignore this? I mean, or are they asking for help? How do we improve?
I think they use the survey internally because it's honest, fair, neutral data. I don't know that they have that support from left or right for the other organizations, or certainly from the top. So look, let me just give General Motors, for instance. I'll probably have 3 or 4 meetings with their staff. They tear it up. What does it mean in a constructive way? They tear it up. What does this mean? How do we work on it? And Jeff Morrison has me come into his staff meeting and present the results. And you can kind of see him set the tone around the table of how he wants each of his direct reports to work with each other. And that filters down through. Nissan has me come into their supplier advisory committee, that the suppliers, and present the results. The suppliers are there, and Nissan leadership is there, so they're hearing the same message of how the suppliers are judging them. And again, that sets the right tone in terms of responses.
So you guys are fairly granular in making this survey. I mean, you look at different parts of the vehicle, you look at different types of relationships, timely communications, effective product development involvement, resolve payment issues in a timely manner, resolve tooling, on and on and on. So is it a case where the person who is in charge, when you're in these meetings, like, is pointing at his direct saying, hey, you're the guy who needs to resolve this communication problem that we have? Because you guys say that communication is basically at the core of the good relationships.
That works best when we do the survey for the vehicle manufacturer at the commodity group level, because in the press release primarily reports out corporate, but that is built up, and body and white is different than electrical and electronics, different than raw materials. And so the OEMs that have us do the survey, we have the data, so we can recode it to their suppliers and which groups they're in, and we report those back. In those meetings, yes, the vice president of purchasing then has the data to work with to be able to say, pick an example, raw materials, it's a communication issue. It's not necessarily paying your bills paying our bills on time. But with some other groups, it's resolving the price disputes or the tooling disputes effectively. And then those groups, if they use the data right, can go to manufacturing or engineering and say, you have to work with us better, because look, we're getting rated down because you're not working with us. So that's how that works.
Dave, when it comes to purchasing, it's all about cost. That's the fixation. But you mentioned several other things, benefits that cost accounting does not capture. A launch that goes smoothly because you got great relations and suppliers are working with you. They're bringing you their latest technology before they show it to your competitors. They, if you've got a problem, as you said, they put the A team on it. Is there any way of capturing the value of that? You know, top management is driven by cost, and they look at most of them, maybe not Toyota and Honda, but the rest of them look at purchasing as a way to take cost out. And but there's these other benefits that the cost accounting method does not capture.
We have tried to look at all of the financials of the 6 and to get apples to apples comparison. So take out all the accounting changes, take out all the special charges, so forth and so on, to try to get it clean. And then you look at, for instance, Stellantis's financial performance versus their rating in our survey.
It doesn't compute. I mean, they're extremely profitable and with lousy supplier relations.
Now, if I would take that over 10 years and you look at Toyota's profitability or Honda's profitability, it may be less in any one given year, but it adds up to be a better, or if you look at company valuations, right? It's better from that standpoint. So that's one element of it. The other element, what we've done is we went back and looked at preferred company, which OEM was the preferred customer. And we came out with our customer of choice composite. We went back through all the data and it's statistically valid. And it's not earth-shattering, but it is intuitive. What makes up a customer of choice? All right. It's the trust that the supplier has in the customer. It's about making a fair return on investment in the book of business. And it's about rewarding high performance. It's no different than if you would do an employee satisfaction survey, right? And what do you want to work for a boss that you can trust? You want to get paid by the company fairly for what you think you're putting into the company, and so from that perspective, and if you look at the customer of choice, it lines up exactly with the WRI, top to bottom.
Toyota, i.e., they all want to work with Toyota, right?
Toyota in first, Honda in second, and so on. Now, where I think we're going to get to really using the survey in the OEM strategy is at the point now where the industry's at with the changeover in electrification. All right, there's only so many suppliers who have the new technologies and the capacities when you're thinking about whether it's the battery value chain or electric motors, inverters, power electronics, all those kinds of things. And if those suppliers who have that technology and capacities, they're only going to work with the companies that they can make money on, they trust, and get rewarded well. And so I think that's where we're going to start seeing supplier relationships or the supplier piece of the puzzle go up in the importance from that standpoint. Because back to some of the other, where we may have had revolts in the industry before because it was across the board, right? It impacted now I think what you might see is one or two of these suppliers say, we're going to back away.
Not bid on the business.
Yeah, we're not going to back. And I'll tell you, I mean, that was clearly when Nissan hit bottom. And we went in and we presented that to Nissan. and then it floated up to the top. That's what got their attention. And what got their attention were verbatims, were comments from our study where suppliers were specific. We're managing Nissan down. And just one last quick point.
Yeah.
When I would present that data, I said, look, it's an anonymous survey. And actually, I don't even want to know who's saying what where. But you have to be certain that the person who's saying we're managing Nissan down is one of the suppliers who's on your exit list too. Because if they're on one of your strategic supplier lists or a new technology list, those are going to be two ships passing in the night, and that's a disaster.
Can you talk about Stellantis in particular? Because this year, as you're aware, we've had part suppliers refuse to ship parts to Stellantis. They shut down the Jeep plant, as you know. They're all involved in a lawsuit right now. Do you think this will rise up through the organization, taking your data?
Yeah, the issue there is, I do believe those are the exceptions. The ones that come to the loggerhead and say, we can't work anything out other than pulling the trigger on a stop shipment, which is absolutely the worst place both parties want to be in. And so I think that's an exception. The piece, Gary, maybe getting back to your question about how seriously do they take it, and can these companies ever get off the bottom, is what I worry about is the mindset that, okay, well, if it comes to that loggerhead, then we find another supplier and we'll just substitute out. Because then all of a sudden it's not an exception. That becomes more the rule of how you handle supplier relationships. And that's what I worry about. People have asked me, well, wait a minute, how can you possibly report Stellantis improved their overall relationships this year? But if you look at the data behind the corporate number, still 70% plus of the respondents say they have a bad relationship with Stellantis. So it's not like they're shifting over their supply base to having much greater or better supplier relationships, even though the corporate number goes up. It did.
But it's nothing to brag about.
70% are still saying they're bad. Yeah.
No, I was going to ask Ken. So, Ken, when studies like this in the Harbor Report of years gone by, when it would come into, say, Ford, and you were dealing with the top executives of Ford at the time, I mean, did these guys believe it, or did they just basically say, never mind?
Well, there's several approaches in bureaucratic organizations. The first is denial. The second is the shrug, the corporate shrug. And then the third is, we'll do something about that in an undefined period of time. But to come back to the transition now, I mean, basically, I view the automobile business with the EV transition, which will happen. I mean, it's just a question of when, and there's going to be some bumps in the roads. But it was a blacksmithing business, right? You banged it, you banged it, and you shaped it, and you welded it. Well, now you're dealing in a much more complex universe. And to come to Stellantis as an example, Tavares, the head is on record as saying that there's 4 stars that have to align, and they're all in the areas that David is talking about. I mean, we have to have clean energy as a society, right? So as that affects Stellantis, well, that's across the board. How are you powering your plants? What are your vehicles doing? The charging network, huge issue. And that's beyond any, in my personal opinion, any corporate attempt. Now you're into the wild card of government regulations and subsidies and various local practices. There's the product, which is what we're primarily dealing with. Well, the material cost of the product is what? Half? I mean, off the top of my head, I mean, enormous. So there's where the relationship's got to be really important on the recovery and stuff. And then ultimately, this all comes down to, and let's try and repeat after me. I used to say once in a while in a Ford meeting, we only design and develop and test these things. We have a customer out there, and they've got to be able to afford it. So now you've got all these opposing forces, and it takes, but it takes, it's a high wire act with no net. I mean,
That's a good analogy.
Basically, and but I would, David, have you ever looked at quality versus? Have you ever tried to correlate quality?
We have. That's a tighter variable that I think could be done. And not to get into over technical piece, but you can definitely show a correlation with quality, because I do believe the suppliers with the better relationships, they're gonna, if there's an issue at the assembly plant, they're gonna send out their best team to try to solve it. And then, John, I think that gets back also to the Toyota culture, is when they call on the suppliers, and maybe this is the engineering piece, but they're trying to solve an issue. It's not to create the blame or assign the blame. And the suppliers are going to go into that situation every day of the year. But if it's about assigning blame, then they hold back out. The other one, John, as you were talking about, with purchasing, it's all about cost. And this is one thing I want to start expanding the conversation about, is a supplier, when they look at a return on investment for a business, it's about that program piece price, right? Without a doubt. But if an OEM, and this comes back to what you're talking about, Ken, if a supplier tools up for 200,000 units of a new EV program, and it gets cut in half, and the supplier is sitting there with half of its capital unused, that's a cost of doing business. And so they could be making a lot of money on all the other parts that they may be supplying, but that one program is going to drag them down. And so they're going to look at that OEM and say, we can't make money on you. And that's an element that, when we also look at the survey, we take a look at business practices and buyer characteristics. And looking at, I think one thing I'll take some pride in, over the last 10 years and over the last 6 that we've been responsible for it at Plante Moran, at least for 4 out of the 6, not looking at Stellantis and Ford that are at the bottom, the buyer characteristics are at the highest they've been in the last 10 years. So the purchasing organizations have really tried and responded. But there's only so much that the individual can do. And so we have to start talking about new business practices in the industry to deal with all the volatility. And I got a few examples that we can get
Look,
into.
we got to take a quick commercial break here for our sponsor, Bridgestone. One thing I'd point out to the audience, we just came out with our industry report card that looks at all kinds of things, ranks the top automakers in the world. Look at the category for quality, and you'll see that what David Andrea just said, those with the better relationships with their suppliers tend to be at the top. Those who do not tend to be at the bottom. But anyway, we'll get back to the show in just a minute. Right now, a shout out to Bridgestone.
When the elements are working against you, being confident in your grip on the road is what really matters. Bridgestone Alenza tires. Improved acceleration in wet conditions.
All right, we're back talking about the tension that's always been there between suppliers and automakers.
Yeah, let me just pick up on the piece with quality. That it also reflects engineering and manufacturing and the way they work with suppliers too, right? And so it's not just in the purchasing
Correct
piece of it.
Yeah. So here's something I'd like to ask you about. Right now, automakers have got to transition to EVs. EVs are still too expensive. Automakers are desperate to cut costs. They're looking at Chinese suppliers who have, based on everything I read, up to a 30% cost advantage. What do you think is going to happen there? And not just in the US, Europe, and elsewhere too. Here you've got, and who knew there would be a whole new supply chain coming on the scene. We thought, Europe, US, Japan, South Korea had everything. And now here come the Chinese with a decided cost advantage. How do you think this is going to play out?
It, without a doubt, it puts pressure on the legacy supply base. But for the legacy OEMs to become competitive in this new world, that's where I think they have to drop their own cost of doing business. And so you're right, the 30% can be, if it's calculated, right? Whatever, even if it's 15%, let's say, it's huge. But if it goes into a system that's overly complex, that has late engineering changes, that has poor quality control, you name all those elements of it, what does that 15% get you? Right? You still have to get the mothership has to be competitive to keep that 15% going, or it's net it washes out.
Totally agree. But at the top, finance is going to say, hey, look, those guys are a lot cheaper in China. Why don't we just buy everything from there, or as much as that we can politically get away with?
And I still will contend that you'll see the launch problems, you'll see the quality you'll see the warranty expenses in there because you don't have the whole system. That's one element where we look at for profitability of the OEMs versus with the supplier relationship pieces. You just can't pull all those other elements apart. And so if you have great designs, you're launching on time, it's impeccable quality, you have the lowest warranty costs, that's what wins. And it's not the piece price. It's not.
In fact, you might be better off paying a little bit more.
Well, yeah, but see, that's the other one, that you pay a little bit more, but that gets booked in this quarter's accounting, right? And I can't prove 3 quarters from now, 6 quarters from now, that I avoided. We can't account for cost avoidance. Is tough. It's intuitive. It's up there. So
you can't prove a negative.
You can't.
So I want to get back to what you were saying before. And so a supplier builds a factory or builds a line within a factory to supply an OEM with 200,000 units, as you suggest, and that gets cut to 100,000 units. Now, the supplier has paid for the capacity to do 200,000?
Correct. Well, yeah, so they've expended, they've invested in that, but keep going.
Okay, so then they find that everything that they had predicted is cut in half. So as we go into this new EV world, I mean, is that any different than if they were making carburetors?
No, so it's not, but I think it gets back to what Ken was getting to. we pounded metal, we've done all castings, forgings, all those things for all of these years. We pretty well know how to do that. But now, and we have the factories, maybe it's now a whole new factory, but look at all the new battery, everything else going up. That's all new square footage. And that's the issue. And it's new technology, it's new equipment. It's not putting a new mold in a press that's been paid for 30 years, right? It's an all new press, it's all new capability. So what we've been talking about coming out of this is the risks and the costs in the industry are going to be there. And so the industry has to adapt to be able to mitigate those risks. So a few things. So back, Gary, on your example about the supplier has paid for that 200,000 with the 200,000 units of capacity, with the expectation that over a 4-year period, in the piece price and what gets shipped for them to get paid it's amortized into that piece cost. So, and it's easy for me to say the industry has to figure it out, but why can't we have variable pricing? And
so explain that. What you mean
variable
by variable pricing?
is I've priced it for 200,000, my $10 million of fixed costs. I only ship 100,000. So my variable price is based on 100,000 units, not on the 200,000. So I get paid back, but it's over 100,000 rather than 200,000. So the variable pricing goes up per part shipped. You got to figure out, when do you start and when do you stop that and all those things. But it's a smart industry with very intelligent people.
How is this hard? We're trying to train cars to be able to drive with no person behind the wheel, and they can't figure out how to do variable pricing?
It's hard, Gary, because
Uber can do it.
Because what I just said very simply shifts costs and risks from the supply base back to the vehicle manufacturer.
The OEMs would hate that.
Yeah.
Because they come out with a car and they discover, oh my God, this is a turkey. No one's buying it. But we still got to finish out production. And now our costs just went up because of this variable pricing, even though that would be totally fair to the supplier.
Correct. So that's one way the industry can do it. The other way the industry can do it that maybe, but again, shifts risk and costs onto the vehicle manufacturer, is to separate out the contracts. Meaning you go through and you have engineering and design and tooling, and you can look at all the labor hours and you can look at all the fixed costs and all the CAD CAM support and all those other kinds of things. And the supplier can say, okay, for me to tool up for this program, here's my $10 million bill. That's on this cost. And that's outside of that variable cost that I just ran through. And if you want to buy 100,000 units, that's fine. I can calculate 100,000 units of labor, of materials, of energy, with the standard, all those kinds of things. And here's your bill for that. That's one way to do it too.
I like that idea.
And with like, even going back with Tesla, and certainly with Rivian and the other startup OEMs, I'm saying Tesla as a startup today, but when it was initially, that's the way they did it, because the suppliers didn't know these companies.
Tesla paid for the supplier tooling up front.
They split it. If the supplier held its ground and negotiated, yes.
Well, look, suppliers have wanted this forever, right? I mean, because if you're in the tool and die business, you start making your your tools, your dies, your molds, at least 2 years before job one, right? At least 2, but you don't get paid until production starts. And that's why so many tool and die companies in the United States dealing with automotive have gone out of business.
It's a pure cash flow issue, without a doubt. Yeah. The third way that I think you can take a look at this is at job one, the OEM requires the supplier to have 200,000 units of capacity in place. All the tools, all the labor, they have to guarantee that. Now, that may be in 3 years or 4 years, but there could be a way, this is harder, is to stair step that up and say, okay, the first year, it's going to be 75,000. So you have to guarantee that you can ship me 75,000 parts. Okay. And then in year 3, it goes to 150. And in year 4 or year 5, it goes to 200,000. And I can stair step that up. That's more difficult because that supplier is hanging out there for year 2 or 3, that they have to know that that tooling supplier is still in business, that they can get that tool and they can qualify that tool for the right quality and get it in place and have the parts inventory and shipment to be able to hit that number.
And they got to pray like hell that in year 4 it does hit 200,000.
Well, yeah, and doesn't crash on the other side.
Right.
But those are all ways that the industry does need to change the way it does its purchasing model that we've had in place for 100 years.
So do they need to change it because of the uncertainty that is perhaps growing now than has been the case in the past?
Yeah.
Or do they need to change it because of the transition to electric vehicles?
Both. And I would say that because we all talk about the risk on the EV side. Well, nobody has said, oh, if these EVs don't sell, the market is only going to be 14 million units, right? Nobody's predicting that. If these EVs don't sell, we're still at 16 million units, but we sell 500,000 more internal combustion nameplates and body styles and all those other kinds. So you got to be flexible on both sides, and just think about, with General Motors canceling the Malibu program, 150,000 units, 130,000, 150,000, and you could look out and say, well, every supplier should have known that. 4-door sedan, this, that, and the other. Well, that's okay, but a supplier can't say that to General Motors. Can't say you're not really serious about this and get the business. You can't do that. So how does GM respond? And I think it will come out in the survey. Well, look, go back to 2019 or so when GM's numbers dropped down. Well, they had a UAW strike that was that they were the strike target. They canceled 6 sedan programs, platforms that knocked the knees out, and they also took out like a third of the overall workforce, executive workforce. So. And Gary's going to check me on those numbers.
I'm going to check you on those, but
yeah.
Okay. But I want to hear. Here's what I want to check you on is that okay? Today's a big day for Ford. They're opening up the
Grand Central Station, Michigan Central
Michigan
Station.
Central, and I mean, and so you're mentioning that there was a dip at General Motors in terms of the survey. Yet I'm looking at this, and General Motors has not been behind Ford since 2016. When they were down at 250. We've consistently been seeing Ford going
downward.
Yeah. So in this, I mean, it's downward even under Mr. Farley. It's been just
Yeah,
it's
well,
just been heading. How is this sustainable?
it's not. No, it's not. And even if the OEMs, not answering specifically with or for Ford, start vertically integrating and bringing parts inside, they have to be good customers because you still have to have the capital equipment. You still have to have everything. You still have to have suppliers to the suppliers, even if it's internal. And so I don't believe it is sustainable. And there's breaking points where management changes and then you start reversing. Now the problem is I think the pendulum swings. Getting back to Toyota and Honda, they may not make a lot of headlines. You know, the pendulums may swing back and forth a little bit this way and that. Then catching up is more costly. It is, without a doubt, I think. And look, it wasn't all that long ago. It was at the beginning of my career when there was
Not that
Ford.
long ago.
Well,
Come on.
no, there was Ford Parts Group, right? Internally, that became Visteon, that got spun out. Look at General Motors, had all of that internal capacity that became Delphi and all the other spin-offs there. Why was that? Well, it was because at that point in time, the OEMs weren't convinced that they could be competitive, right, that they could be innovative. And so you had to have an independent supplier do that.
Well, there's a great issue here that involves things called the capital markets and special items on your financial reports. Mm-hmm. And that was going back to Motorcraft and Visteon and that whole disaster. That was a way to clean up the balance sheet by moving. They got
all the
I'm not
the pensions and all the employee benefits but and all those liabilities.
Yeah, but in the long run, I mean, you're still going to have to make a return on investment, and you're still going to have to publish annual reports, and including, things like 10Ks and all those dreary SEC regulations, which I don't believe are going away. And you're talking about a whole, I was searching in my mind, a whole new type of contract in the business. Or are there any in place that capture this, such as the step pricing?
Not across the board, but there are one-offs without a doubt that have variable pricing in them. Mm-hmm. The divided contracts are definitely with the new EV makers, and even but you take a step back and you say, okay, even how different is the Lightning and the Mach-E under Model E than Tesla was 15 years ago. It's a risky venture. Yeah, it's within Ford and with Ford Credit and back to the equity markets and everything, that Ford has in terms of its stability at a corporate level. But how Model E isn't that much different than it's trying to get a new supply base. It's trying to get a new organization with a new clock speed, with new capabilities. And so, and that's the thing that I think is the big struggle is, and you have a case study here. You had Ford that was trying to do two organizations under one. And, the jury will be out how successful that will be. And I think the supply base, looking at their numbers, a lot was collateral damage between that. Where are we Ford Blue? Or are we there? Or are we there? Who's the decision making? And then you had General Motors that basically kept everything together. They did separate out some purchasing groups for software and for other EV components, but they kept it because they wanted to be one GM. And I think that shows up in their numbers.
So, John was mentioning before about the Chinese suppliers being more cost effective. If we look at, larger BYD coming to this market or other companies, and you said earlier about how part of this goes back to, okay, there are a limited number of suppliers who have the capabilities to provide the OEMs with the new technologies necessary for EVs. So presumably this means that if you're a good customer, you're a Toyota or a General Motors or a Honda, the likelihood is that you're going to get interest from these guys rather than if you're Stellantis or Ford or even Nissan to a certain degree.
Yeah, or even, the suppliers who have kept both capabilities under one roof, right, and not spun them off into individual companies. Yeah, I think that's where it'll gravitate, because they have financial, well, Bosch is a little different, corporate ownership and things like that, but they have responsibility to the capital markets and to their shareholders. So they're going to gravitate to where they can make money and where they can get rewarded for high performance. And this was the interesting thing with General Motors this year, was they went up by 2 points, right, to 299. They didn't break through that 300 mark. Their measure on rewarding high performance suppliers went down by a statistically significant 0.15 points. So that meant that if you took a sample out of our sample, the suppliers would have said, no, GM didn't reward me for being a high performer. And they also went, it was interesting, at the corporate level, they dropped a little bit in corporate trust, but Jeff Morrison's numbers, his personal numbers in trust went up, and the buyer's numbers, my buyer is trustworthy, but the company isn't, also went up. And I'm not saying that GM lost, it was 0.03 or something where they went down by trust, but they did. They were piling it on, trust. And it went down a little bit. So
what happens 5 years from now?
5 years from now?
To the OEMs, if they need a greater dependence on fewer suppliers. The aforementioned Mr. Tavares said earlier this week that he was getting rid of, or he would need, 45% of his existing suppliers going forward. I'm thinking, boy, if you're in the other 55%, you're really feeling good about hearing that.
No, you don't, and that's a similar position. Oh, he's saying it up front, that Nissan was in, right? Where I would be worried about two ships passing in the night is there's going to be suppliers who are in there who may not know. Are they in the good favor or out of favor? And you always want to control your own destiny. And so you start managing that down, because it's survival. And so that's again where I think, from the quality standpoint, the cost standpoint, all of those things do show up eventually. because that supplier churn is extra costs for into the product. It certainly is extra risk in launching these complex programs, and I think it ends up hurting the OEM in the long run. So that's how I would answer you, Gary.
We're good. Look, we're right down to the end here. One very quick last question. Automakers like Ford are talking about insourcing all the software work. You know, suppliers have made enormous investments to be able to develop software capabilities. How do you think that's going to play out?
So far, it hasn't played out well from the standpoint, I mean, if you think about Volkswagen and the other OEMs that have pulled that in, only to see time budgets and cost budgets get blown through. But it's almost as if I'm not criticizing the companies, but it's almost as if you have to learn it yourself. Everybody is in a different situation. Everybody's unique, so we have to go through it. You know, interesting, like with Ford and Argo, for instance, that why didn't that work? And particularly to share costs with other vehicle manufacturers, and maybe it's because they can't purchase things outside as well as they should, and a whole new genre. It's not a stamping, it's not a forging. We don't have a cost model easily for software. So I think the pendulum will swing back, and we'll probably have some creative ways that we engineer around some of those software needs to eliminate some of the need for some of the software. Or how do you do a platform architecture that they could do internally? It's not a real good answer for you, but I think there's ways that we do around it. I don't think that's one element. Let me just say it this way. That's one element with great, to be able to bring in outside resources, outside engineering, and to be able to pay for it, integrate it in, is a competitive advantage. I do believe it would be.
Real good. With that, we're going to wrap up. But Dave, Andrea, thanks so much for coming on and letting us get down into the details of the latest supplier survey.
You're most welcome. Thank you all.
Yeah. Thanks, Ken.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And Gary, I'll see you again here next week.
Absolutely.
All right, there we are.